Welcome to this short review of the chess strategy behind bishops of opposite colors. And so in this position, it is white's turn to move, and he has an extra pawn, which he's trying to push forward and attempt to queen, and black is trying to block his progress. And we see these bishops of opposite colors control different squares from one another. And so that can be a problem for the person who's ahead in material trying to queen his pawn, because one bishop controls the opposite squares from the other bishop, and that helps to prevent any progress that white is trying to make. And so this game may continue with f4. Normally when you have a pawn majority, you want to push the unopposed pawn forward. And so here these black pawns oppose the white pawns on the G and H files, but nothing opposes this F pawn, and so white will attempt to push it forward and try to queen. And so all black has to do, because he has this opposite bishop, is to just move it back and forth and continue to guard the king side from a distance. And so white continues to push forward his pawn, attempting to make progress, and the bishop just moves back and forth, guarding this square here, and also the G7 and the H8 square, just preventing white's pawns from making progress, as we will see. So G5, and now contact is made, and so here black can just exchange off pawns excuse me, and a trade is made. And so white will attempt to press forward, but black just maneuvers his bishop back and forth, keeping an eye from a distance on these squares. And so here the king maneuvers around to h7, preparing to escort his pawn, his G pawn possibly, up to the queening square on G8. But this bishop just keeps an eye on things, moving back and forth here. And now this unopposed F pawn moves forward, but there's nothing that white can do to make progress, as black can just exchange off. If white captures here, then the bishop would just capture his final pawn, and it would be a draw. And with bishops and kings on the board, there's no way to win with that. And here white decides to play a tricky move, pushing his G pawn now instead of capturing, and attempting to win by pushing to G7 with check and then promoting. But here the F pawn is just moved forward, allowing this bishop once again to keep an eye on things. And so here, if bishop captures and this pawn just moves back and forth, if white presses forward, the bishop will just capture and white will not make any progress. So that is an example, when you have bishops of opposite color, how the side with more material can be ahead of pawn but still not be able to make progress, because this bishop will just defend the squares that the opposite colored bishop cannot attack. And so here we'll go on to another example. Excuse me. Here's an example of bishops of opposite colors, where white is ahead with two pawns, and we notice here that there is only one file in between these two pawns. So many times one side can be behind two pawns and still hold off the advance of these pawns if there is one file in between the pawns. As we add more files between the pawns, if there were 2, 3, or more files in between these pawns, it would become harder to stop them. So first we'll see here how white will stop these, or excuse me, black will stop these white pawns from advancing. And so white moves to the side to prepare the advance of this F pawn. And once again, this bishop just moves back and forth, keeping an eye on this line here to prevent this pawn from moving forward. And for white to win this, he would like to push this pawn forward and force black to exchange his bishop off for this pawn. And if that bishop is exchanged off, then white will win, as he can just move over and wait for this king to move out from in front of this pawn and force this pawn forward. But as long as this opposite colored bishop remains on the board, white will not be able to make progress. And so the pawn moves forward. It looks like he's going to head up here and force a trade of the pawn for this bishop, and that would win the game. So the bishop just moves back and forth, keeping an eye on this square up here, and the pawn pushes forward, and it appears that if black just moves his bishop again, white will press forward and force the exchange. But here the king moves from its blockading of this D pawn and moves over to guard this F7 square with the bishop, and so they work together. And so now if this pawn would push forward, the bishop could just capture the pawn for free, checking the king, and no progress would be made. And so white decides to attempt to move over to the other pawn and try and force that one through. And the bishop just remains on this diagonal. And as the king moves, the bishop just continues its back and forth motion, but remains on this diagonal to prevent this bishop from pushing forward. And the king maneuvers around. The bishop continues once again. And the king comes over to this side. But now, after the king goes back here to d7, once again it blockades this pawn, and it cannot make any progress. And the bishop keeps an eye on this other pawn. So this is a way with bishops of opposite colors where the side who's behind in material up to 2 pawns will prevent these pawns from moving forward. Now, if there had been other pawns on the board, it may be a different story. If these 2 pawns needed to be prevented from moving, and let us say if there were other pawns over on the A file, the king could maneuver over, especially if it was 2 opposing pawns, and then the story would be different. So just remember, in bishops of opposite colors, if you're behind 1 pawn, it's possible to stop that pawn, and in the end sacrifice your bishop potentially for the final pawn, as white cannot win with just a king and a bishop. And it is also possible to stop 2 pawns if they're only 1 file apart from one another, as the king can guard both of these squares one square away from the queening square. So once that king was up here on e8, he kept an eye on the f7 square and the d8 square and worked with his bishop. But if these pawns had been further apart with 2 files between them or 3 files, then it would be much more complicated. And so I invite you to review this bishop of opposite color endgame and the strategy behind using the bishops of opposite color. And there are many different variations and possibilities in these opposite colored bishop endings. And I just invite you to go over them and try them out with a friend to see if you can press forward with the winning side or if your opponent will hold you to a draw. And if you've liked this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, and have a great day.